With the recent reveal of Bastion, we can finally glean a bit more about what exactly a main tank is supposed to mean in the new system Evercold introduces that segregates tanks into dedicated main and off tanks. But, in a way, this also gives us a bit more clarification on what an off tank is not supposed to mean. Let's discuss first what we know about Bastion for almost certain, and what that means possibly for the other tanks. And then take a bit to try and analyze the actions we saw in the Bastion showcase. This also gives me time to show off the Bastion footage a few times, so you have a chance to come up with your own ideas if you haven't yet, before I present what I see. Now, let's get to it. Bastion reveals what a main tank is. To start, we have outright been told by Yoshi P that Bastion has support actions that can be used to protect or heal allies, that are flexible. Admittedly, this reveal was very vaguely explained, but let's just say that Bastion probably has something similar to Paladin's Holy Sheltron and Intervention, which is only a single button in Evercold. And it isn't unlikely it has more than that, to match with Paladin's Clemency. While this is not entirely unexpected, it is good to have confirmation that what we saw Paladin had in the Evolved Mode preview at the NA FanFest seemed to be meant to stay, and not something that just happened to stick around on the chopping board, possibly as a red herring or smokescreen of what actually comes. Yes, we can always be suspicious. But the important part is that this does mean that party support is not something main tanks will not have. This of course leaves up for us to wonder what makes off tanks better at that, but this is not information we have yet. Counters. Based on the reveal trailer itself, we did not see Bastion get hit directly, so while one of the moves shown might be a counterattack, the only real evidence we have for Bastion definitely having a counterattack of some sort is the main tank off tank reveal stating that main tanks have that as a core feature. Ranged Lamal. This is actually the funniest but also most important core feature, quote unquote, revealed about Bastion when it comes to main tanks. As the main tanks both turn out to have ranged attacks as part of their main attack rotation in some form, it means that unless Warrior, Dark Knight, and Gunbreaker suddenly get something like that too, this is a unique feature, whether intentional or not, of main tanks, to have ranged attacks part of your attack rotation and not just be a backup attack option like Tomahawk, Unmanned, or Lightning Shot. While this probably sounds really silly as a core feature, the sheer level of convenience that such an option brings to the table for a tank and a party is immense. During a ranged burst sequence, a paladin can, at minor loss in Dawntrail, walk early to make sure the boss gets to where they need to be for the next mechanic, where other tanks might lose uptime if they move too fast or too soon. In Evercold, Paladin appears to now generate their oath gauge for Holy Sheltron simply by time, and so no longer would lose defensive resources from being out of melee range. Another detail to this, which is more speculative, but I think worth mentioning, is that none of the jobs in the Evolved Mode preview at NA FanFest auto-attacked at any point, so it is possible that auto-attacks are going away. I want to be clear that we have no official statement about this and only have the demonstration, and it is perfectly possible auto-attacks were turned off or for whatever other reason simply didn't happen. It could be something as weird as enabling auto-attacks from using an attack just hadn't been added to the Evolved Mode attacks yet. And during the demonstration, it wasn't a particularly relevant thing to worry about. But if auto-attacks are gone, and the oath gauge is generated by time instead of auto-attacks, and with Paladin no longer having regular melee OGC attacks to keep track of, as Expiation comes as a follow-up after the 1-2-3 filler combo, Paladin loses nothing ever from being out of melee range while performing their ranged combos. In Dawntrail as Paladin plays now, having the blades and all of that incidentally overlap with a period where you need to reposition hard is always very welcome, but due to the fact the cooldown is strict, you don't really have much say in the matter of when that happens, which makes it helpful when it happens to align, but it only does so frequently. In Evercold, Imperator appears to have 2 charges, meaning, yes, indeed, you will want to spend one of them to make sure it keeps charging, but it also means you can always choose to keep one in hand for when you need the flexibility. Unless something changes, the Divine Might you gain from Imperator also has no duration on it, so you can hold that Confiteor until you need it. Which is also emphasized by the fact that, largely speaking, damage boosting rate buff burst windows will be gone with Evercold. So, where in Dawntrail a lot of this hypothesizing would immediately be cut short by, yeah, but you gotta use all of those things in the 2-minute burst, that won't be the case in Evercold, as far as we know. Presumably, Bastion will go about their ranged attacks slightly differently than Paladin, but the fact this is something they have in common is interesting. To reiterate the information we were given about the main tank and off-tank situation, any combination should work. However, for the hardest content, the intent is that one main tank and one off-tank would be considered optimal. And exactly how you balance that numbers-wise without ending up with one of them just being superior in general, while still making sure both work, is a brutal task. You can't make off-tanks take too much more damage than a main tank, as that would massively impede their ability to tank in even casual content. And if off-tanks, for instance, do more damage than main tanks, if the main tank doesn't bring something invaluable to the table, why wouldn't you just bring 2 off-tanks for the extra DPS? And similarly, if off-tanks take too much more damage than main tanks, or if main tanks take so much less damage than off-tanks that they can get away with more than off-tanks, why not just bring 2 main tanks? The properties that make main tanks and off-tanks off-tanks have to be either non-stackable in some form, so having 2 of one isn't as helpful as you'd think, as is the case with pure and barrier healers. Or the properties that make them distinct have to be softer things that aren't as easily measured, and can be more about convenience and lowering the stack of things to keep track of when you have one of each. For instance, since main tanks have counterattacks, it is more inconvenient to have 2 of them, since the main tank much more easily can deal with the counterattack stuff when the boss is swinging at them anyway. Meanwhile, an off-tank doesn't really care about that. So being off-tank, but as a main tank job, would be very awkward, but not really a big issue. You can sort of see this in Dawntrail, where some Dark Knights may appreciate being main tank simply because it means TPN is slightly more convenient to manage for themselves. But it is not something so crucial that Dark Knight being off-tank would ever be an issue. Similarly, having a Paladin main tank for its ranged burst to reposition the boss more easily is sometimes nice to have, but unlikely to be the deciding factor in which tank you have main tank in your parties. Definitely helpful to consider though. A shield! A core feature of Paladin that has sort of always made putting them as off-tank mildly awkward is the fact that Paladin's shield allows them to block attacks. And they cannot block for others, so when the Paladin is not tanking something, that mitigation is just going to waste. It's not quite the same, but imagine a Gunbreaker using camouflage while not actively tanking. All those extra parries are just not going to happen. And indeed, it would probably not be a surprise if Bastion also can block, with them also having 2 shields. And you know, while we're here anyway, I guess in retrospect it is for the best that Paladin didn't get totally focused on shield-based attacks and focused more on swords and holy magic, because otherwise we'd have 2 of those, potentially, with Bastion. Which is to say, in summary, that with the reveal of Bastion and the specific overlaps between Bastion's design and Paladin's design, we can now more confidently talk about what makes a main tank, as we can at least more effectively determine what properties are definitely main tank properties rather than just evolved mode tank properties, and what is just Paladin properties. Call back to a previous video of mine on this topic. A main tank appears to have a counterattack of some sort, a shield for blocking, meaning some portion of the tank's defensive budget is based on a constant chance to reduce damage, and of course, ranged attacks, making a main tank far superior to an off tank at positioning enemies correctly without losing damage output. We can also tell based on the information we were given about Bastion that Paladin is not unique in having party utility among main tanks, and that the party utility we saw it had is unlikely to be a fluke or an oversight or something else, because Bastion is stated to have things like this too. What stays unknown for now is exactly what makes an off-tank an off-tank. My best guess is that maybe they reintroduce maintained damage-reducing effects like tanks had in Heavensward, and then make it so they don't stack. That way, an off-tank would actively reduce the damage taken of the entire party, while also not being super handy to have two of, but without making it catastrophic if you do anyway. And with that tank discussion out of the way, let's take a closer look at what moves Bastion seems to have from that preview footage. Right out the gate, this action producing magical barriers over the shield box almost suggests there might be a cast time. What exactly this does is hard to say, as it is probably defensive, and as the dummy that is being fought does not appear to swing back, we can't know for sure. My best guess is that it might be the short defensive equivalent to Holy Sheltron. In fact, the time the animation takes, I would say, is comparable to Holy Sheltron. The first attack being used appears to be a ranged attack that does not use the guns in the shield box, which means that it is likely the basic ranged attack that all tanks have, equivalent to Shield Lob or Tomahawk. Afterwards, a very elaborate gap closing move is used, which, if Bastion's gameplay is meant to sort of alternate between melee and ranged combat, I know it's a tank, you can only do so much, it would make perfect sense for Bastion to have an elaborate gap closing attack, which is a relevant contrast to Paladin, as with Evercold, Intervene loses its ability to do damage, and instead can also be used to dash to allies to provide brief moments of cover. Afterwards, the Bastion performs this back and forth swiping combo, finishing on a fourth hit with a multi-hit that culminates in a gun explosion. My guess is that gap closing move itself enables this combo. Given the speed of the combo, it's even possible that the left swipe is maybe an OGCD, but I wouldn't bet money on it. After this combo, the Bastion switches to gun mode with an elaborate animation. I do want to call back to the Viper reveal a few years back that in that preview, it almost looked like Viper deliberately could switch between modes in a similar fashion. At least a little bit, so it might not be as clear as it looks. The likely story is that this elaborate animation is equivalent to something like Imperator enabling the magic burst. But maybe for Bastion, it switches your other buttons to this gun mode, so it is a more strict type of mode switching. This would also enable Bastion to do more with less buttons, which would make space for that swiping move we saw before. After the mode switch, we see a sort of ranged 1-2-3 combo that does look flashy enough to suggest it is probably a burst comparable to the Blades combo for Paladin. And right after finishing it, the Bastion uses a defensive with a big sphere shield that could look similar to a Gunbreaker Super Bolide, or perhaps the 40% defensive cooldowns like Guardian or Great Nebula. I feel like it is more likely a 40% defensive than an invuln, as I would hope that would look even more distinct from the other tanks than that. After that, we see this quite interesting attack where the Bastion shoots into the ground to hit the enemy, followed by a big finale that could look like an attack with enough weight behind it to possibly have a cast time. A bit like we saw Bard having a single attack with a cast time to really sell the weight of it at the NA FanFest. This is likely a line AoE attack while we're on the topic. If we take a second to consider that it is possible Bastion will feel a lot more similar to Paladin than maybe we would initially expect, then it is possible that the ground shooting attack is equivalent to Confitio, Divine Might, while the Line Blast could be the counter attack. And if we continue this aggressive comparison, the right and left melee swipes could absolutely be the Bastion's filler combo that possibly could be as simple as a 1-2 combo that builds a resource or something that enables the bigger multi-hit attack. Or the multi-hit attack is actually the counter attack. That being said, with the amount of attack buttons we saw Paladin have, it is a very real possibility that this preview showed all of Bastion's attacks. But what do you think? How do you imagine Bastion working? I would love to hear about it all in the comments. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to support me and my channel more directly, you can become a member like these wonderful people here. You can also alternatively support me through Twitch or Ko-Fi, links in the description. You can also support the channel by letting the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, sharing, and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. Fun fact, Paladin's Requiescat worked a bit differently back in the day. In Stormblood, it only gave its magic power boosting effect if you used it while you had at least 80% of your maximum MP to begin with. And while it did boost the power of your spells, whether healing or damage, it didn't affect the cast time, so you had to stand there and cast Holy Spirit 5 times for that damage.